Welcome to part 2 of the lecture on Prejudice, Stereotypes, and Discrimination. In this part, we're going to begin by talking about what causes prejudice at first. And there's, of course, many theoretical explanations and frameworks to understand prejudice. Some of them are based on personality psychology and explore characteristics such as authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. But over here, we're going to talk first about social identity theory. This is one of the more important social psychological theories that attempts to understand and explain and predict prejudice and prejudicial behavior. And it goes back to Tachfeld and Turner, who in '86 started to describe the theory. And it starts with three basic assumptions. Assumption number one is that as human beings, we very readily and easily categorize the world, whether it's plants and animals into species and genera, whether it's elements into the periodic table, or indeed human beings. And of course, typically we categorize human beings on the basis of the most salient criteria. So not necessarily things that are invisible, like political orientation, but very much things like ethnicity, to the extent that ethnicity is actually visible. It is not always this case. But we start by categorizing. So we categorize, but beyond categorizing, we actually identify with the group that we are in. And of course, you know this group to be referred to as the in-group. So it's us versus them, in-group versus out-group, because the more we identify with the in-group, the more we actually begin to contrast the in-group against the out-group. And two immediate implications of this positioning into in-groups and out-groups is, first of all, the in-group bias. And the in-group bias is quite simply the notion that in using any metric that you like, whether it's likability or popularity or how ethical a particular group is, the in-group always tends out to come out favorable. And that's why if you ask a typical classroom in Canada, compare Americans and Canadians for a moment. You think, which group is more racist? You're likely to come up with Americans. Which group is more peaceful? Which group is more environmentally friendly? Which group is more welcoming to refugees? It doesn't really matter. Odds are that you'll interpret the in-group as being better on any of those dimensions. But another implication is outgroup homogeneity. Now, homogeneity itself means that everything is roughly the same. And it is true, we do tend to perceive the outgroup as being more uniform, more homogeneous than the in-group. And this picture illustrates this to some degree. So, of course, we're talking about an in-group and out-group. It's us in the center, that's the in-group. And you can see there's quite a bit of diversity, different colors, and we appreciate that as Canadians, we're quite diverse from coast to coast. Very different experiences when you encounter people in Newfoundland versus the Yukon versus Saskatchewan and the Vancouver area. So we recognize diversity within the group, but we're all essentially good in a way that positions us as better than the out-group. And that's why, of course, if you ask Americans the very same questions, they, of course, will believe that they are superior if the in-group bias is at work. Now, of course, a couple of other things. You are seeing that all of the outsiders, the out-group in this case, are relatively homogeneous, but you'll see the one individual to the top right. That's the exception. That's the exception to the rule, and that individual, of course, we readily recognize exceptions to the rule, even amongst the outgroup. But of course, the fact that the exception allows us to maintain in our minds that the rule, in fact, is that they are all the same. Now, building on this, social identity really starts with a perceived need for self-esteem. This is not just a desire for self-esteem. It proposes that a need for self-esteem is really basic and it underlies much of our thinking. So, of course, we know that there's already many ways to satisfy this. We've talked about this earlier in the course when we talked about the social self. Whether it's you as an individual achieving things individually, doing well at school, getting a job, being accepted into a graduate program that you've been meaning to or hoping to get into for years, that can all boost your self-esteem through a personal achievement. But over here, we're interested in those blue boxes where your social identities manage to enhance your self-esteem. Now, earlier in the semester, we talked about basking in reflected glory and the group achievements that can enhance your self-esteem. But with prejudice, we're talking about the one right at the bottom. How favoritism towards the in-group, in other words, the in-group bias, and also the derogation, or putting down or discriminating against the outgroup, can also boost self-esteem. And this becomes quite a challenging conversation, because to start to consider that perhaps underlying some of the prejudice that we see in the world is people actually feeling good about themselves, having more positive self-esteem, higher self-esteem. And so the puzzle of how to address prejudice becomes a little more complicated in light of that. Now, one of the areas of research that is quite fascinating when you look at social identity theory and prejudice is a particular way of doing research that's called a minimal groups paradigm. And over here on the left, you're seeing, of course, a whole bunch of dots. And imagine, instead of appearing, permanently just static like this, imagine the dots were flashing on the screen right now, right? And imagine as a participant in a study, I show you a flashing series of dots, and I ask you to guess how many dots you're seeing on the screen. Yeah, it doesn't really matter what you say, but those of you who come up with guesses that are lower are going to be called underestimators. And those who come up with guesses that are too high are going to be called the overestimators. At least that's what you're told. Because the whole notion of a minimal groups paradigm is to create an in-group, out-group boundary, to create a social identity based on a subtle manipulation that's meaningless, really quite arbitrary, that was created in 2 minutes that people don't have strong ties to. So we've done this, and the participants in the study are led to believe that they have been placed in the same group as other individuals who've come up with similar ranges of guesses as they have. Of course, interestingly, in reality, the researchers actually simply randomly assigned all of the participants into one of these two conditions. They completely ignore the number of dots on the screen. So it's not even that there actually could be a perceptual difference in terms of people's estimation or ability to see. There is truly no difference across these groups. People just believe that they estimated a similar number of dots. Another way in which they did the same thing was they showed participants a series of different paintings, asked for their preferences, and at the end of this, of course, they tell them that, oh, you seem to prefer the Klee school of painting or the Kandinsky style of painting. Of course, in reality, they were simply randomly assigned. But that's only the first half. The second half of the study occurs once you've already been placed into these two groups. And that's when you're given an allocation matrix. That's what you're looking at over here. And your job, of course, is to decide, as it says over here, how much money every member of your group, the in-group, gets to take home, but also how much every member of the out-group, the other group, gets to take home. And you can see two options in front of you. Option 1 involves the in-group getting $2 each. And the out-group getting $1 each. Option 2, on the other hand, the in-group gets $3 while the out-group gets $4. Now again, if you're thinking perfectly, logically, and rationally, like many economic models do, option 2 is a better option, because you should really only care about what your in-group receives, and $3 is superior to $2. But the pathetic, fragile nature of self-esteem is such that the majority of participants feel threatened by option 2. They would prefer option 1, because they would prefer to take and receive less money, but as long as the other group doesn't receive more money than them. And it's along these lines that I'm hopeful that you've watched the documentary A Class Divided, which you might really consider a field experiment with minimal groups, the study with Jane Elliott. Now, of course, this is not really an experiment. It's loosely controlled, and of course you can debate the ethics of this as well, running this sort of a game in a classroom without the prior permission of the parents. But nonetheless, the point is this: we don't usually classify ourselves according to eye color, and it's worthwhile considering whether indeed some of the effects we're seeing is a result of a very quick, subtle social identity boundary being created via eye color distinctions. Another point that I'm going to ask you to consider as well is how we might better understand the performance of some of those children on the word cards, the vocabulary card tests, when they were in the group that was on top versus in the group that was at the bottom, and whether it's possible for us to understand their performance through the lens of stereotype threat that I talked about in the first half of this lecture. That's something you should certainly consider and study carefully ahead of the exam. One last note concerning social identity theory, and that has to do with what happens to the boundary between the in-group and out-group uh, during a time of threat. Now, of course, when I say threat, it could mean direct threat in terms of perceived danger, but threat can be economic threat as well, and as we'll see with the next theory, it can be existential threat, a sense that your life is meaningless and that it might end soon. Um, so we do know, for example, that threat in any of these ways can precipitate an increase in prejudice. A boundary between the in-group and out-group that might otherwise be somewhat porous might allow people to transfer from one group to the other through, for example, immigration, starts to get strengthened, and so that the psychological boundary becomes much more firm. And this is related to research that again speaks to self-esteem and social identity theory that shows that once people express prejudice, in fact, the actual process of expressing prejudice can actually potentially restore people's self-esteem. All right. With that, I want to move to the second major theory of prejudice coming from social psychology, and this is terror management theory. Now, this is really quite an interesting theory because it's quite controversial. This idea was come up with, was generated by three researchers while they were in grad school, Tom Pizinski, Sheldon Solomon, and Jeff Greenberg. And it starts with this assumption that human beings are unique. Now, they mean unique compared with other animals, of course, in the non-human animals. But they mean unique as well in a very specific sense, that human beings are not just aware, but we are self-aware. We don't just think, well, we can think about our thinking. So dogs can surely think, but it's unlikely that a dog is sitting over there thinking to himself or herself, oh, I've been thinking somewhat negatively today. That's a human trait, this self-awareness, this meta cognition. And so they suggest that one of the negative consequences of this self-awareness is that we are acutely aware of our mortality, that one day we will die, and the likelihood that in fact there's not much more to life than that we are simply a living, breathing, consuming, defecating blob of protoplasm, and then after a few years, poof, we're gone. And this thought that life is short, life will end, and after that there's nothing, is frightening to people. Now, of course, how do people deal with this sense of what's called existential angst or existential anxiety? Meaning. We say, no, life is not meaningless. There is a purpose. There is an afterlife. There's good reasons to live life according to a particular ethical code, whether it's karma or promises in terms of what happens in the afterlife or something else. And so you can broadly argue that culture, and in fact your cultural beliefs and practices, provide you with a sense of meaning. Religion would be one example of this. Again, this is the theory. And so the idea is, if we are holding on to our meaning framework, if we're holding on to our cultural beliefs as a way of keeping under control our anxiety and fear of our death and mortality, that should mean that any threat to that cultural framework will result in a really severe reaction on our part. Another potential prediction is that if you instead directly remind people of their mortality, the fact that they will die one day, you should see people clinging on even more strongly to their cultural beliefs and meaning framework. And that's where terror management theory uses what's called a mortality salience prime. And this is simply a subtle, very subtle reminder to people that one day they will die, as uncomfortable as that might be. And what you find is you can do this a number of ways. You can give people a questionnaire, which asks them a bunch of questions. In the middle, you ask them directly, describe what will happen to your body after you die. It's an uncomfortable question, it's an odd-code question, but still, you can ask people that in the middle of a long questionnaire. Just one question that's explicitly about death. And of course, if you want to make sure that this question about death has actually led people to think about death, you can include what's called a word completion task. So you can start a word with, let's say, the letters COFF and allow them to complete it with two other letters. And what research shows is that when you give people a mortality salience prime, they are much more likely to finish that would stem with coffin as opposed to something like coffee. Anyway, what research also shows is that doing this, reminding people of their death, doesn't just lead people to think about their death, but it in fact does lead people to cling more strongly to their beliefs and treat people who have different beliefs rather poorly. In other words, prejudice. Increased support for the in-group, increased derogation of the out-group. This is the worldview defense reaction that we see when we remind people of their death. Prejudice increases when you remind people of their death. So, a couple of studies that illustrate this. This is a rather famous one, and this one did not include undergraduate students as participants. They had 22 municipal court judges from Arizona as the participants of this study. They were given a cover story. They were told that they were helping out with a case for law school. But anyway, their job was to simply read through this legal case, this brief about the case of an alleged prostitute who had been arrested and who was up in court. And they had to recommend the amount of the bond that would have to be paid. Think of this as bail as they're awaiting trial. Now, of course, there's an independent variable over here. So half of the judges had been randomly assigned to the experimental condition in which in the middle of a very long questionnaire, they are asked that question about describe what's happening to your body or what will happen to your body after you die. The other half are not given that question. And you think, given the same case, given the same brief, given that they've been randomly assigned into the two groups, it should make no difference whether they've been asked about their death or not. But of course it does. The control group, the ones who have not been reminded of their death, come up with an average bond of about $50. But those who've been primed to think about their death, about $450. That's on average, of course. Why would this be? Well, what's the meaning framework that judges hold on to? The law. And so, of course, they should treat people who violate or challenge or threaten their particular belief system, their meaning framework, in this case, the law. They should treat those people more severely, and they do. But there's two sides to the worldview defense reaction, right? It's not just treating people worse, members of the outgroup. It's also treating members of the in-group better. And so, for example, in the same context, if you describe the case of a hero who's done something brave, doesn't matter, man, woman, let's say typical case, running into burning buildings, saving a child, and the town wants to reward this individual. How much of a reward, a monetary reward, should we give them? And again, control group, you want to reward them, but maybe what, $1,100 in the control group? But when you've been reminded of your own death, the average reward is about $3,500. So you see both sides over here. Worse treatment of the outgroup and better treatment of the in-group, especially when you've been primed with your own death. Now, this is a provocative theory, and you may disagree with many of its assumptions, including the idea that human beings in general are terrified of their own death. But to be honest, there have been a lot of researchers who've been rather upset and challenged in the assumptions and the predictions of terror management theory. And so for the last 25 years, we've had researchers designing studies to challenge the basis of this theory. But quite funnily, practically all of the researchers ended up supporting the theory. So we actually have a ton of research which actually does suggest that the theory does have some truth to it. One last illustration, and I'll just show this slide as well, because they've been rather creative in testing terror management theory. And as I said, there's two ways of doing this. One is what I showed you previously. You can remind people of their death. But the other way is to simply challenge their existing framework of meaning. And so they had, in one case, undergraduate students who were all Catholic. And they're in a room, they're doing a task, and then the researcher comes in and says, hey, listen, I would really appreciate if you could help me with something. There's a nail that's fallen out of the wall behind you. Be a huge help for me. I just need to step out of the room for 5 minutes. But if you could hammer it into the wall while I'm away, use anything you can. And of course, you know about obedience and those power relationships already. Everyone says, sure, sure, sure. But they look around and the only thing in the room that they could possibly use as a hammer is this large wooden crucifix. Now, of course, for a Catholic, that's deeply uncomfortable to use a crucifix in that fashion. It's disrespectful. It contravenes their belief. But of course, they do it anyway because of the obedience dynamic. And after doing this, you see the same worldview defense reaction where they support the in-group more and treat the out-group worse following that particular task. Another example of this is you have highly patriotic Americans in this particular study that I'm thinking of. And again, same thing. Oh, oops, I just knocked over a pot of ink. Oh, heavens, please help me to soak it up. Just use anything you can. I'll run and grab something from the other room. But the only thing that you could possibly use is an American flag. And of course, again, this is something that's threatening in terms of what the flag represents. And the use of it for something like mopping up spilled ink. You see the same results once again. One last note on terror management theory. As I've already suggested, there's a lot of research that supports it, but of course it's not without some controversy as well. There is some research, for example, that suggests that the critical ingredient over here may not be a fear of death, but in fact it may be uncertainty. Death is simply one thing that represents uncertainty, but there's many other things that can make us uncertain. And so you see experimental research where they try to make people feel uncertain in a way that has nothing to do with death. Of course, another condition would be the mortality salience prime, which is arguably a reminder of death, plus uncertainty that goes along with what happens after you die, and a control group. And they're starting to indicate perhaps that uncertainty shows the effects of terror management theory, even when it has nothing to do with death. So that's a debate that's playing out in the literature. One last note, I did want to share one particular technique. I know you're going to read about more in your textbook as well, but one particular technique I wanted you to be fairly well aware of is what's called a superordinate goal. This is a particular technique for prejudice reduction that involves getting groups that are opposed or that harbor prejudices against one another to work together, not because they want to work together, but because working together is actually the only way for them to achieve a higher goal, a goal that actually matters to both groups, and a goal that cannot be accomplished without the cooperation of the different groups. In your textbook, you'll read about the Robbers Cave study, which is an example of realistic conflict theory, of course, but the way in which Muzaffar Sharif resolves it is through what's called a superordinate goal. The last thing I'll say as well about a superordinate goal is that I would like for you to go to my YouTube channel and under the social psychology playlist, which is linked to from the course website, you'll notice that there are a few videos. And there's 3 videos, in fact, in particular, that are from the television show Friends. And these have to do, these have to do with parts 1, 2, and 3 of The Bullies at the Coffee House. And so if you watch those 3 videos, each of them is about 2 minutes or so approximately long. I think that gives you quite an interesting and fun illustration or depiction of the use of a superordinate goal. Well, that's all for this particular lecture. We'll pick it up when I see you next. Thank you.